Can you hear me? Okay, I don't know if it's any better. So, who is Abdelatif Abdallah? Abdelatif Abdallah is still alive. Actually, we wrote to him to prepare this evening, and we chose the poem together with him. Abdelatif Abdallah was born in the area of Mombasa, northwards of Mombasa, in 1946. So, Kenya was still under British rule. And very early on, he didn't really start off as a poet, more as a political activist. He studied law in Kenya, but he comes from a very ancient Swahili family, and his grandfather and his half-brother had also been poets. And so what changed his life is that he got incarcerated in 1969 by Jomo Kenyatta's administration because of a pamphlet that he published, which was called Kenya Twendapi, so Kenya, where are you going? Which was a very sort of engaged pamphlet against what was considered the complicit actions of the newly formed Kenyan independent government, which he accused of letting down on the promises of independence and of liberation, which independence had sort of brought together for many workers and sort of peoples of Kenya. So it was a very harsh, a very strong hymn to liberty, which got him into the worst prison of Kenya, which was the Miweti high security prison of Mombasa. And he served there 4 years until the beginning of 1973. So in the harshest of conditions, in an isolation cell, so that he could not, pass on his propaganda to any other cellmates. So he was in complete isolation for this time. He could only write letters. He talks about it a bit. And from his time in prison, he wrote this collection. He had already written something before called The Story of Adam and Eve. But he wrote it before, but he only made it into a collection afterwards, because it was his passage in prison, in the high security prison of Mombasa, which changed his relationship to poetry. And this is what he wrote in prison. Sauti ya Diki. So I think most of you speak Swahili, so of course I don't want to be explaining to you, your culture and your language, but so Sauti ya Diki means voice, sauti, of agony, of distress. And for a very particular reason, I'm going to choose tonight to translate it with anguish. And we're going to discover why later on. So voice of anguish. So he publishes, which he composes during his time in prison. He writes the poems down on toilet paper, and he sends each poem singularly to his relatives. And it's only afterwards, after he left prison, that he decides to recompose this collection, you see, which wasn't made which was made consciously, but in a sort of fragmented and parcelary manner. And he reconstitutes it and becomes this masterwork of Swahili poetry, which had an enormous influence then on the rest of Kenyan literature. What more can I say is, as you'll see, the language he uses is not standard Swahili. So he comes from Mombasa, and he uses the dialect from his city, which is called Kimvita, as you know. And why this choice? Well, there are many reasons. One is, of course, we could say that he is very much engaged in defending the pluralities of Swahilis which exist. But it also has a political sense, this decision. And why so? Because it was the British who came to Kenya and who decided on one particular version of Swahili, to be used, officially. And they based their decision on what the Germans had already decided before, which was to use the Swahili of Zanzibar. So they said, it'll be easier for commerce, for trading. We're going to use the same Swahili as the one which is used a bit more south, the Swahili of Zanzibar, and we'll use it as well in Kenya. And this is the Swahili that, we now learn, Kiswahili Sanifu. But Abdelatif Abdallah decides not to do that, or he uses a mix. And it is precisely maybe because he wants to, in a political move, reconnect with this language and also, introduce plurality where maybe colonialists tried to impose a sort of form of unity from above. He is a very special poet because he writes he finds the sense of his writing from behind bars. The bars here sort of show it rather clearly. And he develops a very unique style of writing, which doesn't really follow the sort of the traditional, rhyme schemes and meter of Swahili poetry. Which normally is written sort of usually in its most classical form, as you know, with verses of 4 lines, which we call a bait. And there's normally only one rhyme which runs through the whole poem. Yes, this is a result of the Arabic influence, of course, because it's Arabs which first introduced this mono rhyme, rule to to their poetry and their meter. But nevertheless, he is very modern, but he is very much influenced by other big figures of sort of from the past, and particularly by Muyaka bin Haji, whom you know, and he actually starts his collection with a quote from Muyaka bin Haji. So Muyaka bin Haji is the first secular Swahili poet of which we have the name. So beforehand, we have a very, very large tradition of Swahili poetry, mostly religious, we're talking about the Prophet Muhammad, but we have a bit of secular poetry still from the 12th century, little bribes. But they're mostly anonymous. We're not sure even if they're oral traditions or written traditions or, to what extent they're which. But Muyaka bin Haji, who lived between 1776 and 1840, he's the first one whom we know exactly. So we know who he is, what he did, where he lived. And he inspired himself very greatly from this figure, who was quite politically engaged also in his city of Mombasa, because he was a very harsh critic of the Omani rule of the Swahili coast. And so you can sort of see, okay. I don't think there's any, so I think we can read the poem now, and then I'll continue sort of talking a little bit about the poem, asking a few questions, and then I'll open the discussion very quickly, I hope. So, of course, we'll first read the poem in Swahili, then we'll read someone in the audience could read the translation in English. It's a bad translation. I've made my own. We can discuss this as well. And yes, so here we start, and I'm very pleased that I can now pass on the mic to someone who, for the evening, is going to be our Swahili guest of honor. So Felix Gatumo, please, you have all the space and the time to read the poem in Swahili.
Sawa sawa, shukran. Nitawasomea shairi lenye mada ya takoma. Sitokuwa nayo dawamu daima, dhiki nilonayo iliyo negema. Tawa mbali nayo utue mtima. Utue mtima na kutabaradi, papatue kama ua la waridi. Zitakapokoma zakwe tashididi. Zakwe tashididi zinganilemea, nitajitahidi kuzivumilia. Nipate muradi ninaongojea. Ninaongojea pasi atiati, kwa moyo mmoja tamaa sikati. Ungalimatia si kwamba sipati. Si kwamba sipati kwa kukawa kuja. Hatua sivuti mudawe na ngoja. Saa haipiti talivaa koja. Talivaa koja la yangu subira. Nipate natija hilo barabara. Subira kwa mja ndilo jambo bora. Ndilo jambo bora litakikanalo. Hili kila mara mtu awe nalo. Makubwa madhara kutokuwa nalo. Shukran.
Shukran jazilan, that's Arabic. Thank you very much. Let's read it twice in English for it to sort of sink in. I'll read it first and then I'll give it to someone just so we can hear it a few times. Yeah, I'll give it to Elaine. Okay. It will end. It won't bedevil me forever and ever, this agony I now have weighing on me. I'll get far from it, so my heart may gain relief. So my heart may gain relief and calmness, so it will bloom like a rose when there's an end to its distress. Although its distress overwhelms me, I'll try hard to endure it, so I can attain the aim I await. I await it without wavering, wholeheartedly and ceaselessly. Delay doesn't mean I'll miss it altogether. I'll not miss it altogether if its coming is delayed. I'm not moving a step, I keep waiting. In no time I'll wear the garland of flowers. I'll garland myself through my perseverance, so I achieve a rightful reward. Perseverance for humans is the best virtue. It's the best virtue, much preferred. The virtue one should always possess. What a disaster for someone without it.
All right. You want me to read immediately? Okay. It will end. It won't bedevil me forever and ever, this agony I now have weighing on me. I'll get far from it so my heart may gain relief. So my heart may gain relief and calmness, so it will bloom like a rose when there is an end to its distress. Although its distress overwhelms me, I'll try hard to endure it, so I can attain the aim I await. I await it without wavering, wholeheartedly and ceaselessly. Delay doesn't mean I'll miss it altogether. I'll not miss it altogether if its coming is delayed. I'm not moving a step, I keep waiting. In no time I'll wear the garland of flowers. I'll garland myself through my perseverance, so I'll achieve a rightful reward. Perseverance for humans is the best virtue. It's the best virtue, much preferred. The virtue one should always possess. What a disaster for someone without it.
So thank you very much. I just wanted to read it in English because we're going to be speaking much more about the Swahili text now. So we get the translation, albeit a bad one, so in our minds. So as you see, I think the first impression one gets is one sort of situates very clearly the situation in which the poet finds himself. So, he is in the position of waiting for something to end. And this position of, the weight of waiting, at first glance, is very much to be identified with his position as a detainee. So this is rather clear. And, and this is, sort of natural and understandable if we know, now that we know how this work was born and written down concretely on toilet paper. And I'd like to start off the discussion with the quote, which he put at the beginning of his whole collection by Muyake bin Haji, in which he says, "Ngome intuumiza naswitu mumo ngomeni," which translates so the dungeon, ngome, or the fort, has tormented us, and we are still languishing in it. So the dungeon has tormented us, and we are still languishing in it. So two things. From this quote, we see that there's a clear political orientation to his work. So the dungeon, the fort, has something very political to it. If you think of a place of political repression, and so he puts this at the beginning of his work. But what is quite interesting is that there is maybe a more metaphorical sense, because if the dungeon is still languishing in us, we're not, and he wasn't also his whole life in prison. So what is the dungeon he is actually talking about? So I think this is a rather interesting quote to start off with, and then I'll start off the discussion, because it maybe gives a hint on the two-sidedness of the prison of which he is actually talking about, and to what is the real captivity in which he is finding himself in. What is about to cease or to finish, as the title is indicating. Okay, I've started with all these questions, and now I'm just going to say, so or is it, I'm going to say three things, and they're going to start the discussion. I think the best way to start a discussion on a poem is not to give you my interpretation. I think that's very bad, because this is just me imposing my subjectivity on you. But what I'm going to try to do now to start off the discussion is, I think I have identified three sort of characteristics of the poem, which I think are maybe rather surprising, and then we can maybe you can add some more. And these things, I think, don't really are surprising. Why are they surprising? So what are these three things? So what I sort of see, now we start the discussion, in the poem, which struck me first and which made me choose it, was the structure of repetition. As you could see it in the Swahili, but also in the English translation, you see that each stanza begins with the same words as the stanza before it finishes. If we take the first one, Tawa mbali nayo utuwe mtima, so let my heart, let my heart rejoice. Calm down, sorry. Utuwe mtima. And then we start back again. Utuwe mtima. Or then afterwards, zakwe tajdidi. Okay, you got the drill. So this is something which is rather surprising. Why do we have this repetition? Repetition is very common in Swahili poetry, but mostly it comes just at the end. But here we have something which comes at the end and at the beginning. And this is what we call, in literary studies, an anadiplosis. So this is the scientific term. And so the question is, this would be maybe a first question I can ask to you, is why this repetition? What does it bring? What does it make you feel? What does it evoke for you?
I don't understand something. You say, si kwamba sipati, and in your translation you say, I miss it all together, I not miss it all together. Did you say?
No, I'll go back over the Swahili later on. No, it's okay, Charles. So, no. But the translation is not very good. I'll give my own translation later on. Okay.
Of course.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. Okay. So why the structure of repetition? Because Charles. So we usually understand the way people usually read Abdallah's work is the one of a political activist, and we see his literature as very much sort of very engaged, which it is, very critical of injustice, with a very sort of harsh criticism of of anything which is happening about him and in Kenya, and I do think this repetition goes a bit against this idea of this sort of rolling out of these sort of certainties, which sometimes people associate with this poet, who would be sort of on his high moral grounds, in his sort of posture as a sort of resistant poet. Okay, second observation is I don't know if you, well, what sort of made me sort of feel a bit queer about the poem is the link between the tenses of the verbs, which I didn't really understand. Like, you see on the third line, tawa, which is the short form of nitakuwa, so I will be mbali, so I will be far away, nayo of it. Utuwe mtima, all of a sudden, utuwe, we have a subjunctive form of the verb tuwa. So, and this happens all the time in the poem, that we're sort of going from an indicative to a subjunctive form. Why is that? There's something about bizarre with the tenses. And the people who speak Swahili, I think, felt it much more than in the English translation, because you lose it a little bit. And finally, as you noticed, it may be more in the Swahili than in the English translation, but the poem does have supposedly one idea, so this idea of patience, which is building on, but linguistically it's rather fragmented. It's made up of a lot of very short sentences. There is sometimes just half a line, sometimes one line, but so the structure is what we call rather paratactical, which means that it doesn't go on and on. And that's also something which I find a bit bizarre. So in a poem, which when we read it the first time, seems to be like a pamphlet of the political detainee who accepts his condition and decides and announces his preparedness to await the end. So these three things, I think, are good starting points of a discussion. Of course, you can bring in other elements, but I just think it's always good to give you some concrete elements on which we can start on. So I've talked enough, and let's open up the discussion. We have 2 mics, and I don't need to have one always in my hand. So please, who wants to speak? Maybe there could be someone passing on the mic. I don't know if there's someone.
Hi everyone. My name is Timo Heure. I'm an actor. So I'll just start with the second point that you gave about you don't mind me, I'll speak a bit of Swahili because I've learned a bit of poetry in school. So on the last stanza in Swahili, we call them kibwagizo. I think Kenyans can understand what I mean by kibwagizo. So kibwagizo is the last line of a poem of every stanza. So from my perspective, I think the reason why there is that repetition, like for example, let's go to stanza 1. The last line is uwe mtima, okay, which means utue mtima, which means to calm my heart. And then in the second stanza, the first line starts with utue mtima. From my point of view, I think from what he was trying to do is to put emphasis on his words. Because just like you've said, when people read, some people just read, continuously without even trying to internalize everything that you're reading. So I think that's why there's that repetition to bring emphasis. You're saying something.
No, that's very interesting. And of course, repetition brings emphasis. That's clear. But I'm going to challenge you there, is that, he could have repeated in a very different way. Usually in poems, the usual form of repetition is what we call an anaphora. Yes, we have the same word which comes at the beginning of a line. What we have here is an anadiplosis. So this is a bit more bizarre. So, of course, he wants to put his finger on something, but why does he want to put his finger on the end and the beginning of each stanza?
Okay. So the reason why he is doing that, from my point of view, again, because there's an open discussion, I'm not trying to be really subjective on anyone, I'd say it's because when you check in every stanza, he's talking about something new. And for example, in stanza 1, he's talking about his troubles, okay? In the second stanza, he's talking about his heart being calm and stuff like that. So it's a way that he's using to introduce what he's going to speak in the next stanza. That's what I mean by the whole emphasis. And that's why you see he's basically introducing, like for example, let me think of something. When I tell you there's food downstairs, and then the next minute I tell you pizza has been served downstairs. You see the first stanza, it's telling you about food. And then the second line, I'm introducing you what kind of food is being served. So I think that's about it. Yep.
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking about the repetition as like more of a doubtful form, as in like, well, he's essentially doubting himself. Like he's trying to cheer himself up in a sense. Like, I'll get far from this without my heart may gain relief. And then again, that means that like he's not particularly sure that his heart will gain relief. So he's like, just like telling himself, yeah, my heart, like he's assuring that he's gonna gain relief from this. And I think that the last stanza actually supports that interpretation so far as like, he says that what a disaster for someone without it. I mean, to end the whole poem on not having rather than having perseverance, that sort of means that like, this is sort of his position. He doesn't have that perseverance, or at least he's doubting himself as to having that perseverance, and that's what the poetry is all about.
I think that's a very interesting point. I think I'm going to go back to your point and sort of discuss it very, in detail. But do you feel like this? How do you feel? Do you think the repetition here shows certainty or doubtful restlessness?
I think when analyzing any art form, thinking about the context that it exists helps with understanding it. And so when we're talking about mashairi, Kiswahili poems, we have to understand that they were not read. There's a musicality. So if people who've had watu wakikariri mashairi, there's a musicality to it that I think the repetition helps to maintain. So when you listen to people anywhere reading poems, they don't actually read them. They sort of unagani mashairi, which is sort of in between reading and singing. So it's that tense place, and you need repetition to keep it structurally stable. The second reason why I think having studied fasihi andishi and fasihi simulizi in school is knowing that the way poems are written in Kiswahili, it is sort of like a thread running through where you're revealing something but not too much at the same time. So there's a restraint that many Kiswahili authors and people who work in Kiswahili have, that they won't expose everything, but they will lure you to them slowly. And one way of doing it is to repeat a few words and then to leave and then to go on. So it's like a river constantly moving in a valley.
But what does it make you feel, this repetition? I understand, the music, the role of musicality, of course, which is very, very important. And, you see there is a very big play on words and sonorities in the poem he even changes a bit the grammar for it to be more, like at the end, la yangu subira. So he takes a lot of poetic licenses, and the repetition is one of them, but to what effect?
Yeah, I think definitely some of like dropping some syllables is to maintain the musicality and the syllable count in every mshororo, which is every line. And I think for me, it's just a story that he's telling really well in an art form that is structured. It's a tathlitha, it has 3 mishororos. He's obeying the rules while still being free in it. So for me, it's just a story that he's telling, and it's a very hopeful one.
There's something very interesting that you said. That he is sort of, there's a tension between the formalism of a part of his poetry and the liberty in which he takes, particularly in the rhyme scheme. And I think there's something quite...
Like, as it ends, he's talking about the virtue of perseverance. So I'm feeling every opening and every closing is like trying to show that in every chapter, as you open and close it, an opening of another chapter is a closing of another one. So you need perseverance to understand that sometimes when you're starting, it was just an end of another chapter, but again, whatever chapter you're starting maybe had good, like others were in the verses, or bad, it will still come to an end. So that ending is an opening of another chapter, and so on. That's my thought.
I think that's very interesting that this anadiplosis is maybe an image of this perseverance, of this unity, which this steadfastness, maybe this lexical steadfastness, which sort of lingers on from one stanza to the next.
Okay, thank you. My name is Martin. I'd like to mention maybe 2 things on a different take on the same. So maybe looking at his situation, mandhari aliyokuwa katika, sometimes there is what is called ilhamu in Kiswahili, what motivates a poet to come up with an idea and all that. So as a political detainee, probably he was in the same routine. He wakes up, repeats the same thing over and over again. So at some point, I don't know what was going in his head, but as a poet, probably if you are in a repetitive sort of an environment, then ilhamu yako itakuelekeza katika kujirudia, and sort of that maybe to express your situation. Second take probably just on what she mentioned about musicality. Sometimes the poets, the traditional poets, mostly from Vita and Lamu, would have considered this a song. The poems, which probably were 3 lines and mizani 6 katika kila kipande cha mshororo, sometimes were considered as songs, and songs are repetitive. So probably that is my take too.
No, of course. Thank you very much. I think maybe a good way of moving on now and getting more maybe into the very text. It's please Charles.
wanted to remind that in French is the same, as you know. I know you will quote Verlaine at the end.
Okay, yes.
I know. It's also a mnemotechnique. I don't know if you say that in English. Mnemotechnique way. As you know, for example, Homeros was not written at the first, and the way to remind the story was the repetition of some words and the structure of this word. And just as a reminder, in ancient Greek, the word strophe, which means in English stanza, means strophe means to turn. So to turn from one point, you turn from one point and you go back to the same point. That's the definition of strophe in French.
Yeah, and also in Latin, a verse, is like when you say let's reverse the car. Reverse is to turn around. Well, to versify in a versified form, it's the same thing. And it's okay. I think one point which I'd like to bring to you is my questioning on the title, Yatakoma. So, kukoma in Swahili means to finish, but more specifically, if what I read in my kamusi, in my dictionary, is true, it means more precisely something which finishes, but without the agency of an exterior actor. So it's not so much finishing as ceasing, if you see what I mean. So yatakoma can be translated by it will cease. Of course, there's a whole discussion to have about what is the ya, what is the it, which in Swahili is not as general as the English it, because ya refers to the plural of the liya class. So we have to find now a noun in ya which can correspond to yatakoma. The debate is open, but so yatakoma, it will cease. And then the first word of the poem is sitokuwa nayo. So it will not be with me. Yes? And what is interesting is that in yatakoma, we have something which ceases, independently of the will of the author. This is koma, and not maliza or isha. But it starts with sitokuwa nayo, with the first person. And I think there's an interesting sort of tension in the poem between the idea of, the poet's relationship, personal relationship, to finitude, to what he's trying to finish off or what he's trying to attain, and the more larger picture of finitude which he addresses. So, yes, what are your thoughts on this tension?
Hello, everyone. I'm right here. So, my name is Frank, and yatakoma is a pretty, I would say, ni neno ambalo lina ibua hisia nyingi kutoka ndani. For those who don't understand, yatakoma is a word that invokes a lot of emotions. It sort of like talks about a lot of madila problems someone is enduring, and you sort of like have to persevere for it to end. You can see the end of it. It's sort of like being afflicted to you, and all you can do, it's not within your power to sort of like end it. So all you can do is sort of like persevere, endure until it comes to an end. You do not have control over it. And then just to take it back a few, the moderator was starting, Alexander, he said he took note of the fact that the Swahili version is sort of like characterized by short sentences. I think we have the specialist there wa Kiswahili, lakini nikiwa shule nikikumbuka vizuri, nakumbuka kuna wakati ambao tulikuwa tukisoma mashairi, kuna mengine ambayo unapata yako na vipande viwili, vipande vitatu, vipande vinne kuendelea. So in as much as we are going to talk about this shahiri, we need to understand that Swahili has sort of like evolved. We're not going to judge it and evaluate it as per the rules that we have of today. This is like judging something by the end. You have to understand This is where it started before it evolved to A, B, C, D. So, I mean, like, let's have that into consideration. It does not really rely on to the rules of Swahili and Shahiri like we know them today. So it's pretty much different. Let's be open-minded to that.
Hapa kwa mada ya takoma nadhani imeelezewa zaidi kwa katika stanza 1. Hii anasema sitokuwa nayo dawamu daima, dhiki nilonayo. Kwa hiyo sasa the heading ya takoma itakuwa alikuwa anaangazia masaibu. Dhiki na masaibu ni mamoja. Hivyo tunasema katika Kiswahili. Dhiki nilonayo iliyonegema, tawa mbali nayo utue mtima. Sasa roho yake itatua, masaibu yatakoma. Yeah. Sorry. I'm saying the title it will end is explained. If you read the first stanza, you will understand what he meant. It won't bedevil me forever and ever, this agony. So he's talking about the agony I now have weighing on me. I'll get far from it, so my heart may gain relief. Yeah. So
I think you're right. You know, this idea of the liminalness of things finishing. You know, he talks about it in the very beginning, but I think what is interesting is to sort of try to sort of feel like what is the what is finishing? You know, is it in the power of the poet, or is it the things around him which are finishing? And I think you sort of see this tension at the very beginning. But this is an open discussion. Did you want to say something?
Yeah, I think it still touches on, I mean, the fact that it's still the agony touches on your point of, like, we don't know what's actually finishing, or at least we don't know what he's talking about, the whole it of the question. I mean, what does agony mean? And what, like, it's a particular feeling. I mean, we know that he was in prison, and maybe you can interpret that this is trying to, you know, think about prison ending. But at the same time, it's not, you know, he never actually talks about prison here. And agony as a feeling, I mean, it could be associated with an existential crisis. It could be associated with like it could be associated with a number of things. It could come out of a number of contexts. So it's, I think you're still very right in saying that we don't know what the agony is. We don't know what the it is.
And as someone put it, if you read the last two stanzas, I think he was encouraging himself. He's saying, I'll guard myself through my perseverance, so I achieve a rightful reward. Perseverance for humans is the best virtue. It's the best virtue, much preferred. The virtue one should always possess. What a disaster for someone without it. So he's encouraging himself.
He is encouraging himself, but he's not saying that he has it. And I think what you said at the beginning was very right, is that the ending for me, but maybe we can talk about it, for me seems as a sort of, he's sort of reckoning his sort of powerlessness to a certain extent. Because, he has this very, very general sort of statement, subira kwa mja ndilo jambo bora, so waiting kwa mja, for a human being, and this word, as you know, mja as opposed to mtu, is more generalizing, is more literary, more philosophical. So, and then, at the very end, he says, so this is the thing. Virtue is a bad translation of jambo. The virtue one should always possess, but mtu awe nalo, we should more translate it as awe, as you know, is the subjunctive form of the verb, to have. So it is not so much, one should always possess, but, this virtue every time may man possess it. And then, then at the end he says, what a disaster not to have it. And it's very interesting how we have this sort of, this rupture from on one side, this very generalizing statement. It is better for man to have this and this. And then at the very end, one sentence, much in the grammar, much more simpler. what a disaster not to have it. And we don't know what is the position of the poet at the end, but this creates a sort of very telling ambiguity. But please, what did you want to say?
Thanks a lot. At a comma, according to the poet, he is referring that it refers to almost three meanings. It will cease, yeah, it will stop, it will refrain. So on this point, it is referring that at a comma. Because we can say in Kiswahili, wewe unaendelea kuja hapo kila siku, utapewa kichapo cha mbwa, utakoma kuja hapo tena. You see, you're trying to come here as an intruder. You'll be beaten thoroughly. The beating of they call it the beating of dog. And you will refrain, will cease coming in here. Thank you. That's all.
So I think it's very interesting that you're saying that maybe if you refers to the poet, to the poem itself, it will cease. I think that is a very good thought. Does anyone have any other feelings or ideas about the poem he or she would like to bring in? Yes, thank you.
I think also we could even look at it from a larger perspective, because let's say his situation currently, it could be referring to a whole larger spectrum of things that he was trying to use his poetry to portray, or the message that he was trying to make popular to his audience at that point. So it could be an imagery of all the things that were happening, and he was just encouraging himself or the reader of the poem that at some point, if they keep the faith and if they keep the hope and the patience of the troubles that they were going through from the larger perspective of the society, it will come to an end.
Thank you very much.
I would like to know your opinion as a linguist, as a non-specialist of Swahili. Me, I'm very happy that we have this poem because I don't know Swahili. I discovered something very abstract, very philosophical, and there's nothing in this poem. There's nothing. But because there's nothing, it's very interesting. And I'm not a specialist. It feels to me very close to Asiatic point of view and Asiatic poetry. I don't know, you as a linguist, what you think about that?
Well,
it's more Asiatic than European, for sure.
I'm not a specialist of Asiatic poetry, but I think it's very interesting what you're saying. This is a poem about nothing, because it
doesn't progress, doesn't move.
Yeah. But it is quite interesting because, but that is maybe the image itself of perseverance and of waiting, his image of awaiting something. But it's true, I think, that there's something that is an interesting tension you're sort of pointing out. On one side, we have a poet which sort of, indulges himself, in these very great, moral generalizations. He has a point of view of a moralist. I am in prison, but, I accept, it says, Taliva koja la yangu subira. So I will wear as a garland of flowers, like koja or bouquet. It is a more poetic word than the normal shadda. La yangu subira.
So is that the only real thing in the poem?
Yeah.
Everything else is abstract, the only real thing is the flowers.
Is the flowers. You have the rose before, uwa la waridi, and then you have the flowers at the end. But so he has these, these postures of the moralist, I accept this, the position of the waiting, and at the end I would be rewarded as a sort of, ancient times hero, with this garland of flowers. And then at the same time, as you pointed out, Charles, you do have the impression that, even though he has this sort of rather grand, sort of stoic posture, at first glance, is that even though he's saying it, the very movement of the poem, of the verses, and the way they're structured and all of that, says something otherwise, says something of, maybe more of a sort of, restlessness and of a sort of, ceaseless repetition, which is maybe not so much, the sign of a sort of resoluteness than of a sort of, maybe discrete desperation. But I think it's an interesting, what do you think? Do you feel the poem does not evolve and is just sort of, turning on itself? Yes, Frank?
Oh, sorry. The poem does evolve to some extent, but then again, in as much as it's evolving, it's still putting emphasis on continuity, not for it to, have a break in between. There is a lot of continuity from, like we said, from having the ending being the starting of the next stanza and so on. And then just to answer your point, when you say the poem feels a little bit more Asiatic than European, I think for those of us who took Swahili in high school and in school, going back to tracing the origins of Swahili, we are taught, has its roots to some of the Arab languages. When we had the Arabs colonize part of the coastal strip, which is where Swahili majorly originates from. So it was like a marriage between the Bantu and the Arabic languages that bore Swahili. So I think, and not just in this Shahiri, you will find in most of them, they would have that, that flow, since it's sort of like paying homage to their roots. You see? Yeah.
As far as the comparison to Asiatic poetry or something like that, I thought actually it was really similar to Shakespeare's Hamlet. I mean, to be or not to be, it's the exact same thing. It's a whole question of, we think that he's talking about suicide, about a particular issue, but it's not at all about that. It's something very grand, something very like cosmic. And this is, I think, what we're seeing here. It's something that doesn't quite limit itself to one issue, but becomes an existential crisis. And I think maybe the genre of Asian poetry that you were thinking of, be Japanese, which is really associated with these things, and it's very still. But yeah, that's all I want to say.
Thanks a lot. I wanted to correct a brother. It wasn't indeed a marriage between Arab and Bantus or anything. The Swahili was formed with a lot of pain and difficulties. To a conclusion, there are multicultural, multi-ethnicity, tribes, sects, religion, etc., and tradition. Like Giriamas, they've got their own tradition and way of worshipping. Jikenda, they've combined with that. So it has been combined with so many languages and words, including the German. Portuguese is also there. Ich gehe nach Schule, I'm going to school. Naenda Schule, still Schule. So it's German word. So I want to correct, brother, that it was formed with a lot of difficulties, and it came to a conclusion that Swahili be spread slowly, gradually throughout the continent. So this is it. And number two, in regard to the poet, it makes a lot of sense. It has got a lot of difficulties and expression, as if this poet was tied up and bound physically, emotionally, and mentally. He has tried to express his feelings in every way he could. And it indicates he was suppressed and oppressed to utter word. Whoever went through the transition period of post and pre-independence know that thing. So that's what the poet is trying to say, and he's trying to express his feelings. That's what I'm saying.
I think that's very interesting, this idea of constrainment, which you're talking about.
Thanks.
And that you feel, even though you sort of feel maybe a sort of a tension between this constrainment and this push to generalization and to sort of distance from his situation that he has from, not speaking, of using a very sort of general language and very abstract when talking about himself, which has, of course, a sort of a universal then ampleur and echo to it. And just maybe before we move on, there's something that I'd like to bring to the discussion. we're talking about the agony, and we don't really know what the agony means, and it's interesting. So, diki is agony here, and it's a word from Arabic. This poet is very, very much influenced in the very formal Swahili, very influenced by Arabic, and diki in Arabic. But I've got an Arabic speaker here, so please do correct me. But if I'm not mistaken, duck can also mean, or the original meaning has something to do with narrowness. With narrowness, then going on to severity. Dikya can also mean the severity of the person or of a situation. And then the third sense is distress, agony, or anguish. So something, which looms over me and sort of closes up my perspectives and narrows them down, yes? And why do I use the term anguish? And I think it's an interesting term, of course, is that because the English word anguish comes from the Latin angustia, which means narrowness. So, when you say anguish does have the same idea of narrowness. And of course, this idea of narrowness, of diki, has something to do with the narrowness of a cell, of the narrowness of a spatial situation, of an existential situation, but also of a more sort of, philosophical one, which we can sort of see, of course, here. So I think it's a very interesting, it's very interesting to sort of, discuss in what space exactly, is the poet, and how can we still be reading, this poet even after, he left prison and he is now very well off being a professor in Leipzig in Germany. So, but I saw that there were many other reactions on this side. So, please. Sorry, before we pass on, but I keep you in mind. Please.
Yes, I just had one remark about the rhythm. As a French, I count in my head. So rhythm is very similar as a French poetry. Like it's 12 syllables, 6. Ndilo jambo bora, then we stop. So 6. Lita kikanalo, 6 again. Yes, so I see you counting. So it's really similar to our rhythm. That was just my input about comparison with other poetries.
I think, thank you very much. This repetition of
6 plus 6. Ndilo jambo bora, ndilo jambo bora, lita. Oh, no.
Yeah. But yeah.
Ndilo jambo bora, lita kikanalo. 6. Just exactly like our Alexandra.
Yeah.
If you read the French poetry, at the end we can count again.
So I mean, yeah.
This
is very interesting. So, and you find
I'm
this.
very surprised.
Yeah, you find this also in Swahili poetry. But, you don't have to have 12 syllables. You can have 10 or more. But in Swahili poetry and Arabic poetry, what is important is that you have a pause right in the middle of the verse, which corresponds to a pause in the grammatical structure. So, but you're right. It's interesting to find this. This half verse which corresponds to French poetry as well. But please, moving on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think just to agree with what he said, I think it's important to be careful about calling it or comparing it to a different style. I think in its right, it's a Kiswahili poem and full stop. And the second thing, when I read the English translation, I noticed, because translation is hard, but I noticed it was very I-centric. But when you read it in Kiswahili, it's a poem that's relevant to us now. Like when I read it, I'm like, kweli, yatakoma. It's so relevant to me kwa sababu sanaa ni kioo cha jamii. It's not just for himself. So maybe if we're looking at it just for himself, we may think it's meaningless. But when we're reading it here, we're like, Mimi, I'm really resonating with what he's saying, what he's writing, that I can really feel the way he's moving with my emotions and my thoughts. And I think it's the tension of that. Perhaps in the West, it's much more centered on a person, but this is a poem for everyone. It's a poem for the community. And even though it was written in the 70s, if I gave it to my mother, my grandmother, if I read it to my peers, they would really resonate with it and they would understand yatakoma.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Anyone else wants to react on this side? Because I thought I had seen more hands. If not, yeah, I completely agree with you.
No, I was actually thinking of what you were saying. I mean, there's there have been a lot of Marxist critiques of aesthetic topics, or at least the idea of like the aesthetic in general, and like, you know, how a lot of European thinkers are like thinking about the stars and thinking about, you know, personal anguish in very particular ways. And there have been ways in which people from the colonies, or at least the post-colonial world, have been talking about how there are some very pressing political issues that we need to attend to. And I was thinking maybe this is a type of co-opting of those traditional styles of you know, thinking about anguish, you know, like Hamlet, and actually like it's a fundamentally political poem. It's fundamentally about what is happening to him in a prison cell, and it's a way of evading that sort of authority maybe that he might face after exiting the prison. And this is some loose interpretation, but you know, there are ways in which certain poets, post-colonial poets in general, have co-opted traditional styles of poetry to, no worries.
Okay.
We have to stop soon because we have
Okay.
sound check. And
Sure.
It's very noisy.
Okay, sure. So,
Conclusion.
I'm
You and Felix.
okay. I'm going to conclude.
Your interpretation now.
Yeah, I think shortly, and then we can have a discussion with it afterwards. I'd say I find it interesting how you're saying how it's not so much all about the individual, but it has, you know, it's not all about the I. And I think the translation has a problem in that it creates a lot of subordinates, which sort of links everything back to the I, whereas there are many more sort of subjunctives, which create sort of like exclamations and interrogations. Okay. What I'm going to say now is a possible reading of the poem. I tried to be complete, but it's... So the French always do 3 parts in everything, so I'm going to do 3 parts, of course. So just showing possible tensions in the poem, and then, you know, of course, we can discuss about it. So the first thing, which we started on, and I think we agree to a certain extent, is that we can consider this poem, firstly, as a sort of hymn to Stoic constraint. You know, because we see all throughout the poem a sort of unrolling of a sort of towering will. You know, the poem starts with this I, and the I, you know, sort of rhythms all the poem. And, you know, the whole poem is basically about the evolution of the inner resolution of, you know, this detainee. This sort of unrolling of this will is then sort of rhythmed by the inclusion of very sort of generalizing sentences, which we call actually in Snobbish language apophthegms. And so he has an apophthegmatic tone, very apophthegmatic. So, like, you know, perseverance for humans is the best virtue. It is the best virtue, much preferred. And that's why we do have, because of this unrolling and of the repetition, a first impression which could be of a certain expression of a sort of, you know, rather harsh and sort of self-aware inflexibility. You know, the poet knows where he's going, and, you know, it is to a certain extent, you know, there's also a sort of political strength to it. You know, that someone, you know, who is in such a sort of secluded and recluded position, you know, finds this sort of, you know, moral high ground and says, no, the solution to it, you know, is a sort of, is an inner higher virtue, which is patience. However, as you said at the beginning, and I think this was, I thought of this as well, is that this sort of analysis of this sort of moralistic position and of this sort of political activist sort of view sort of is not enough. Because the poem, if you look at it sort of closely, is not so much declarative as it is sort of self-searching. So it is much more elliptic, repetitive. And so it's much less than a sort of declaration of a sort of, you know, of this detainee, you know, full of, you know, certainty and equanimity. I do feel you can feel a sort of struggle in the poem, and that, you know, the will, which seemed sort of, you know, resolved, becomes sort of stumbling and slightly more wavering if you look at it more closely. And this certainty, which could have, you know, been expressed by the repetition, becomes a form of stuttering, you know. I think this is an interesting repetition analysis of this repetition of one stanza to the next. He's not opening anything new. He's sort of going back without really evolving, but which shows also a sort of restlessness. So, so the poem, as you said, does not seem so ineluctable, but seems to be sort of showing a lot of uncertainty. And this uncertainty comes also from a sort of ambiguity, you know, of the meaning, but also of the grammatical structure. If you see, for example, at the end of stanza 3, nipate muradi, ninaungojeya. So nipate subjunctive. May I obtain muradi? Muradi, first translation, my objective. Ninaungojeya. We see there are no grammatical links. So it opens a question. Is it an ellipsis or not? Should we say, may I obtain the objective which I am waiting? Or may I obtain the objective, comma, I am waiting? So you see how he plays with this ambiguity. And so we don't know if this I am waiting, you know, is the culmination of the direction of his waiting, of, you know, of his will. May I obtain the objective? Or if it is the sign of this sort of, you know, impossibility to sort of, you know, go beyond this sort of final stop, which is, you know, this act of waiting, but which, sort of, yeah, which strikes you then with its finality. And even muradi has a sort of possible double entendre, because it can also mean, so objective purpose, but it also has a grammatical meaning, muradi or muradi, which is on the condition that. So may I obtain, may I get it, on the condition that I wait. So that is a third set, you know, possible level of meaning. At the very end also, nipate natija ilo barabara. And so it's interesting because so may I receive, may I obtain, again the same verb in the subjunctive, natija, a good, you know, a benefit. This is ilo barabara can mean this is something. Barabara can mean two things. Either as, you know, it's an adverb which means perfectly, or if you pronounce it differently, barabara, it can mean street or road. So we don't really know. You know, he plays on this sort of lexical ambiguity again. Is he saying that, you know, awaiting is the best option, or, you know, is it a path to follow? Okay. So, and same things with, you know, I was talking a lot about the use of the subjunctive here, and I think because it shows that we have a lot of sort of painful, because very wishful exclamations at the beginning. Utuem tima, you know, may my heart gain relief, and not so as my heart may gain relief. So, you know, there's a, but you know, the poet is not, you know, the translator is not wrong, because, you know, there's a sort of ambiguity in how to translate subjunctives, you know, as a final clause or as optative, you know, as expression of a wish. And we are not sure. And so I think that, you know, with the game with this subjunctive, I think that he is sort of also sort of showing the sort of the problematic nature of the will, of the human will, which, if it is, you know, this sort of centered, you know, act of volition, is in the end, as much as, you know, we can be, you know, as we can wish, as we can want it, is always just, you know, a hypothetical will. Okay, and finally, so, you know, because of this and of, you know, the shortness of the subjunctives, we have to do not so much as a sort of rolling out of this sort of, you know, certain activist, but a much more fragmented discourse, which is sort of based on this, you know, constant ambiguity and double entendre. But, and this is then my final point, you know, we do feel the struggle, we do feel the questioning, you know, of this poet who has now been in prison. But if it is a struggle, it is no sort of wailing desolation. You know, as you were saying, maybe, you know, he does speak of anguish, but he doesn't speak of it, you know, as, I don't know, you know, a French or a German romantic poet, as Lamartine would do, you know, going, ah. No, he doesn't do that. And so the whole question is, how do we sort of understand the meaning of this sort of courageous complaint? And my third point, and this is my thesis, is I think that this poem is so strong because it proposes a renewal of the poetic genre of the consolation. So I don't know if you, so what, console is, you know what it means, but it, so, to console someone is to bring someone's spirits back up. But it's also a poetic genre, which was born mainly, in sort of Stoic poetry, in which you would have a lot of sort of Roman poets which would like write poems to, a mother who lost her child. And they would be like, you are crying now, but why are you crying? Actually, you should think again about it, because, this is a cycle of life, and you as well will join it, and we are all, sort of transient beings, and, and all of that. And, then there's a whole genre of the Christian consolation also in the Middle Ages, in the 17th, a lot in the 17th century. It's a very big motif also of Baroque poetry. So, poetics of consolation. But here what is quite interesting is that we have fundamentally the same themes. We have the theme of a consolation, it won't bedevil me forever, I will surpass it, and and a call onto perseverance and patience. But what is quite interesting is that we have a poem, which is a sort of an inner chiding, a call for consolation, but without the whole sort of, let's say, philosophical sort of reasoning, which usually comes with the genre. Normally, we would say, don't worry, because at the end, you will be free. At the end, you will be able to talk. In the end, there will be a life again, beyond prison or something like this. But what is interesting is he talks about all these things. It will be better. I won't miss it altogether if the coming is delayed. But he doesn't really give reasons for it. And this is why you were saying, what is happening? What is he floating about on? And so, this is why I think he proposes a sort of a renewed poetics of consolation, insofar as he shows the image of a sort of uprightness, but which is not based on reasons, but sort of on morals. And what is quite interesting is that he proposes this posture without sort of giving the reasons behind it, and creating sort of ambiguity also sort of as the reasons behind it. And so, because of this moral posture, which is in a certain sense sort of incomplete, and which is sort of filled with his own interrogations, the poem sort of in itself becomes a sort of defiance of sort of the difficulty of holding a moral stance. And at the same time, the poem upholds a moral position, and at the same time seems to show its impossibility, and by criticizing it.